So, imagine it for a moment. The year is 2016, and you are a big fan of the gaming company known as Atlus. With the hype of the recent release Persona 5 running through your veins, are genuinely excited to see what they come up with next. And then it was announced. A development project known as Project Refantasy, a brand new IP title with many aspects set to be a complete departure from Atlus's usual lineup. It looks a bit bizarre, sure, especially with, all this going on instead of actual 3D models, but it doesn't matter. Atlus is cooking something, and you cannot wait. And then it goes quiet. For the next 8 years, we would hear absolutely nothing about the title. No updates, no trailer footage, nothing but dead silence from the newly formed team at Studio Zero. While many held out hope, others lost complete faith and believed Atlus to have scrapped the project altogether in favor of another Persona spinoff. But then, 2023 happens, and at an Xbox showcase of all things, a trailer drops for the game, now known as Metaphor Refantazio, the new title for Project Refantasy. And with this trailer, there it is. All your hype is back, and it just keeps increasing with every trailer and announcement that keeps coming out. And after a long enough wait, the game comes out and it's a success. 1 million copies in under a day of release, and had received immense praise from fans and critics alike. And after playing it myself, I can definitely see why. So many aspects of this game are absolutely fantastic, but I also ended up with some issues that really kept me from giving this game as much praise as others. So what happened? What hurt my enjoyment of the game? What did I think was good? Well, if you're curious, sit down, relax, clean your weapons so they can't fail you on the battlefield, and let me get into my review of Metaphor Refantazio and how it's a frustrating masterpiece. So, to start off my long list of pros, let's talk about Metaphor's sense of style, cause good God is it absolutely beautiful to look at. Atlus has proved time and time again through games like Soul Hackers 2 and especially Persona 5 that they know how to use a game style to make it look immensely timeless. And Metaphor is yet another one of those very well-handled games. While aspects like character designs and the way job classes, or archetypes as they're called, and monsters look are downright fantastic, alongside those absolutely beautiful shots where you're inside the runner and pull over to look at some unbelievably gorgeous scenery, which leads to some of the best shots in the entire game, I'd low-key consider buying a display of one of them if they were ever sold separately, if I'm being truthful here. However, I personally think the best parts of Metaphor's design is probably the UI itself. Persona 5 and its many spin-offs really showed Atlus knows how to make things like UI and various types of menus look especially pleasing to see on screen, and Metaphor might be some of their best work yet. I love the shots of the characters in the pause menu, the crackling of the black and white text boxes on screen, the badass shots of your characters in battle, the goofy-ass slow-mo walk away after battles. It's all so visually striking that I'm just blown away. There are some complaints I have in terms of how it looks, but I will get to those later. For now, we shall wrap up our talks about how good the game looks and move on to what I think about the gameplay of Metaphor, which is a topic that, admittedly, I'm probably the single most split on for the entire thing. As while I have immense amounts of praise for it, it's probably the one area in the entire game where I also have the most criticisms for. It's a strange one, but I still have a fair bit of stuff I liked about it. Metaphor's gameplay is best described as a full combination of every Atlus title today, merged together with a few new ideas to push the years of work mastering these systems in a bold new direction. SMT fans will recognize the main gameplay of the turn-based side of things as the usual iconic press turn system. Now, to be honest, I'm much more in tune with Persona than I am with SMT. The most I've experienced is the bits I played of Nocturne, but I am well versed enough in how it works to know it's done pretty well here. For every person active in your party during battle, you get a shining crystal resembling a turn icon. And for each action you take, whether it be for attacking, defending, using an item, or swapping around your party for a reserve member, you use up a crystal. And once all the crystals are gone, it moves on to your opponent's turn next. Although that's not everything you can do in a single turn, as there are other options. For one, you can spend half a turn icon to skip a party member's turn, so another member can go in their place, which is useful if you have a party member with the right weaknesses or a more powerful attack to help you win fights. You can increase the amount of turns you have by having characters aim for weaknesses or landing criticals, so you can only use up half an icon instead, which if done perfectly can net you 8 turns in one go. Or you can use up multiple turn icons to activate the synthesis skill, which has an insane amount of variety. From heavy hitting singular strikes, to devastating multi-hits, to full party buffs, multiple enemy debuffs, they are immensely useful and very diverse. And they come in serious clutch against bosses. But they also cost MP for 2 party members and can be a major MP drain if you're not careful. Plus, if a synthesis attack ends up missing, it basically costs you your entire turn party, similar to how enemies blocking or repelling weaknesses do so as well, which does add a nice risk reward to your gameplay and keeps you from making it your sole way of combating enemy forces. But how exactly do you unlock these synthesis skills? After all, they're not just handed to you. Well, that's where my absolute favorite aspect of the gameplay comes in, and that is Metaphor's job system. If you've followed me for a while, you know why it's my favorite aspect, but if you're new here, I absolutely adore job systems in RPGs, and hearing Metaphor had one in them actually made it one of the main reasons I wanted to pick up the game. I really enjoyed the Atlas titles I played, and I was rather curious to see how they handled something like a job system in comparison to others, and personally, I think they handled it pretty damn well overall. It has problems, obviously. It's their first ever job system from what I can understand, and it was very ambitious. But I do think it does understand the main aspect of how a job system is supposed to work. See, a lot of people assume that a good job system just means having a lot of different job options. And while that is, yes, nice to have, that's not the main point of a good job system. The main point is just how well do these job systems work in unison to make a solid gameplay flow. Having a ton of jobs means jack and shit if none of them flow well together. Thankfully, Atlas understood the assignment, because there are a ton of useful combinations. You can use the Knight class to draw attention to a singular character while another focuses on healing or buffing the party, or you can have them dish out as much damage as possible. You can use jobs like Faker and Cleric to focus on healing and buffing the party for as much damage as possible. You can build teams to maximize stats. Hell, you can even utilize synthesis skills in this as well to create some powerful skill combinations. Like, for example, when you mix the Dancer synthesis skill of Masquerade Charge with a job like Berserker or Samurai in order to maximize as much damage as humanly possible, using Omniguard to protect your entire party while a Mage class wreaks havoc. There's just so much variety and thought put into making these jobs work super well together. And if you're interested in expanding your archetype's moveset, you can do that by using the skill inheritance mechanic, whereby paying a fee, you can teach the archetype you're using skills from other archetypes you've unlocked, which not only leads to some super interesting mixes and matches that help with tackling Metaphor's surprisingly challenging gameplay, it also helps for the type of gameplay Metaphor is trying to go for. See, unlike games like Final Fantasy V and Yakuza Like a Dragon, where the job system is less of a pick what you want and go nuts style, Metaphor's gameplay focus is much more on you swapping jobs at certain points in order to handle bosses. It's a style of gameplay that's much more about you adapting to any situation you find yourself in and preparing accordingly to deal with it. Personally, I kinda like it. Yeah, it does kind of run into the issue of running into boss fights with the possibility of just getting your ass kicked because you don't have the right build, but this style of play actually ends up making me engage with the gameplay in a more thoughtful way. Instead of just forcing me to use a job for like one single moment, you end up really thinking about what you're going to equip to deal with this specific scenario, which also helps incentivize unlocking more archetypes by interacting with your party members or other select characters through bonding events. And once these bonds events are maxed out, you're able to obtain their ultimate forms known as the Royal Archetypes. But that's only the first part of the gameplay. What about the other new gameplay addition? The mechanic that was one of the biggest driving points for Metaphor. And that was the overworld combat. And let me tell you, it is fine. I'll be real, this is one of the gameplay issues I got the most issues with. It's got some frustrating aspects that soured over time, but I do like a couple things about it. For one, I really like how changing archetypes actually changes up overworld combat. Examples like becoming a brawler nets you hand-to-hand combat, broadswords are slower, mages have AoE attacks, and so on. It's clear they put a good amount of effort into actually making archetypes play genuinely differently in the overworld. I also like the fact that you can actually die in the overworld. It adds an extra layer of danger and spices up an admittedly very flawed overworld system. And then there's also the retry clock, which is a pretty cool addition. It's nice to have an option to restart a boss fight without having to go through the run back and cutscene skipping. Plus, the retries remember the enemy weaknesses, which is a pretty good mechanic, just in case you were too busy getting your asses beat to remember yourself. And, well, that's pretty much all I got to say in terms of my gameplay pros. So now, let's go over to talking about Metaphor's story and characters. They are both pretty much perfect, and this game may have my favorite plot of this year. Now, since these games came out just like, a couple of months ago at this point, I'm not going to go super deep into the narrative and risk saying anything super spoiler heavy. But I will say that the story is very, very impressive. Which starts off as a simple mission to save this land's prince from a terrible curse, becomes a battle for the throne and the fate of the nation, while at the same time tackling themes of race, classism, guilt, and self-doubts. Oh, and of course religious persecution. It's a fantasy series, you can't have that without religious persecution. That's like having a hamburger without cheese on it. All the while facing off with the main antagonist, Lewis, who's not only one of the best antagonists in Atlus's entire library, but arguably one of the best villains this year. He's suave, intimidating, and while his way of thinking is rather cruel, the backstory as you learn more about him makes you understand why he thinks the way he does, which makes him all the more fascinating. But the most interesting aspect about him is how he interacts with the protagonist. He goes from seeing you as just some random follower trying to get into his good graces, to considering you the one person who can genuinely stop his plans. He has an interesting level of respect for the MC that's honestly a lot more engaging to follow than just making him a bitter, hate-filled asshole. Another thing I liked about this game's story was just how in-your-face its message is. I remember some people complaining that this game wasn't really trying to be subtle with the messages it was trying to tell the player, but in reality, I think that helps it a lot. There have been some games I've played where they try to be subtle, and as a result, it just doesn't work and the message really feels ham-fisted. Metaphor actively shoving its messages in your face, I actually think helps the game. I like that Metaphor had the balls to just straight up say, these are our messages, we're not sugarcoating it, you get it. That's great, and I honestly hope more games do that, instead of just pretending to be subtle when in reality they're just not trying. It also helps that in order for this game to really make you understand how beautiful the world is, alongside how terrible, broken, and unstable this whole shithole of a place is, the game takes you around the entire continent. You get to see all of these races interact, how they don't trust each other. It just works so well for discussing this story's very heavy themes. And of course, I couldn't talk about how amazing this game is without bringing up just how phenomenal the characters are. In fact, I personally think that these are some of the strongest written Atlus characters I've seen so far. I love how they can all go from the cast having some deep, genuinely dark and emotional moments with each other, to sharing a single brain cell like a family of lovable idiots. The perfect example of this is when you're hunting for a criminal with large ears. So their plan is to make a lot of noise to draw him out, which at first revolves around them insulting Lewis, but then it turns into them getting mad at each other for stupidly minor things. Of course, their absolute best moments come from the bonding events, which contain some of the most sharply written and downright heart-punching moments in the game, and are easily some of my favorite character writing from Atlus. You enter for the new jobs and stay for the engaging characters. Feels like a great addition if I say so myself. And well, that's all I'll say about the story and characters. I'd go into it more, but the game is still fairly new, so I don't want to spoil anything for those who haven't played it. And last, but most certainly not least, the music is downright phenomenal. I've been a fan of a lot of Atlus soundtracks, alongside being a fan of Shoji Meguro, the composer behind the Persona songs, so I knew it was probably going to be in good hands. And while the tracks did kind of throw me off, being so used to Persona's use of rock and jazz, Metaphors ended up winning me over the more I listened to it. The vocal chanting in specific is super charming, and I recommend giving it a listen even if you don't got the game. And that wraps up the pros about Metaphor. So now, I think it's time to dive into the game's cons. So, despite my constant praises of the many, many things that Metaphor does exceptionally well, I do have a fairly large list of complaints as well. And to make sure this goes smoothly, I'll be starting with my more minor nitpicks before working up to my bigger ones. First off, let's get into my issues with graphics. Now, I think this game's sense of style is downright amazing, and I will forever stand by that as one of the best looking Atlus games in terms of pure style. However, there's one aspect of the game that I don't think looks very good, and that's the character models themselves. Sure, they have great designs, and they look amazing in certain cutscenes, but their overall look in the game itself kind of feels dated. It's something you don't notice at first, because as I stated, you're probably spending a lot of your time looking at all the cool stylized menus. But When you really stop and look at all the models and anything that isn't a well-designed cutscene, you can't help but notice just how janky and sluggish they end up looking. It isn't really much of a deal breaker, it's something that's barely going to affect my overall score of the game, but I do hope that after this game, Atlus decides to create a new and improved engine because it really feels like this one's starting to run on fumes. Other than that, I don't have any other complaints about how it looks, so let's get into my issues with how it plays. Which, I'm not gonna lie, is where a lot of my issues actually lie. And surprisingly, none of them are from the turn-based side of gameplay. Yeah, it can be kind of frustrating losing out on turns due to misses, but that's just life at the end of the day, and I'm pretty sure if I had played more SMT games, I wouldn't have been as bothered by it. So it's much more a minor thing. So let's get into the issues. First off, the grinding. Yeah, so despite how much I like the archetype system, Atlus kind of ended up committing one of the gravest sins you can ever do with a job system, and that's make the late game job grinding a chore as much as it is. The early and some of the advanced jobs are fine, but once you get into the elite and royal jobs, it feels like everything starts slowing to a crawl, to a point where even boss fights feel like they barely give you anything. The only real way to gain job levels in a fast and efficient rate is unless you cheese the system through EXP items. Which, I'll be real, if I have to resort to locking characters to a specific job system and then shoving EXP candies down their fucking throats like they're a Charmander in Pokemon Go or whatever, that's definitely an issue you've got there. Although, that complaint's just a drop in the bucket in comparison to all of the complaints I've got tied to the action portion of the games. Because good lord almighty, was this shit downright irritating. Okay, so minor stuff out of the way for this first. Swapping overworld jobs is tedious. Like I said earlier, different jobs have different overworld combos depending on what you choose. And while I still stand by that being really cool, one thing I didn't really like is that if you wanted to change jobs, there was no real fast or efficient way to do it. You had to basically pause the game and cause the pacing to really slide to a standstill, go to your equipments menu and pick the job you wanted. And at first it isn't much of an issue, but the further in you get, I'd say around the halfway point was when I started to get sick of doing it. Especially when I had to start grinding jobs. To be honest, it's at times like this that I just wish I could equip 2 jobs at once to cut down on the tedium or even control other party members. It's a very minor part of my complaints in the grand scheme of things, but it was something that just bothered me the more I ended up playing. That's the only minor thing though. So let's get into the major problems I had with the action combat. Similar to a game that also released earlier this year, Trails Through Daybreak, the combat in the overworld is set up to give you an advantage, but it runs into 2 major problems that really keep me from fully enjoying it. For one, certain enemies can take way too long to knock down, some taking nearly almost 2 whole combos to get a stun on, and I get the idea they're going for here. It does make larger enemies seem like they're going to be much bigger threats through this, but it honestly starts to fall flat in its face due to the fact that you go down in 1. Which honestly doesn't feel balanced. It's okay-ish when there's just 1 or 2 enemies on screen, but when there's multiple attacking you, it can feel like complete and total bullshit. It also made me wish that dodge rolling actually gave you a buff as a result of successfully timing it right. Yeah, there's a dodge mechanic in this game, but it doesn't do anything. It just gets you out of the way. Let me slow down time as a result of dodging at the right moment, as that would have been genuinely useful in the later parts of the game when it's swarming you with enemies that can knock you down and put you in a stun mechanic. Alongside the fact that getting ambushed by enemies can end up getting you killed in one turn on harder difficulties. So that's always fun. A real blemish on the system for me. I'm hoping that if we ever get a Metaphor 2, it irons out these issues because honestly it is the weakest part of the game for me, aside from one other aspect. And that is, without a doubt, a calendar system. I personally think it's heavily misused and downright unneeded for this game. I don't hate the concept of a calendar system. In fact, I think they're pretty well used in the Persona games. But Metaphor, I feel like it's a game that just didn't need these kinds of deadlines and would have worked a million times better just having a story constantly be on rails. The biggest moments are when you travel to dungeons and you have to spend several days on the ship doing nothing but the same old shit you've done again over and over with a very, very rare chance of a bonding event happening. It eventually gets solved in the late game, but by then I was already burnt out. Outside of that, I don't have any other real complaints. So let's move on to my final thoughts, shall we? Now that I have gotten to the end of the video, what's my final verdict? Well, while I do think this game is great, it certainly has some problems. and a few gameplay concepts that need some fine-tuning. But if they do choose to continue with this style, I can genuinely see this new IP constantly thriving, maybe even dethroning both SMT and Persona as their most well-received franchises at one point. And that's why my final rating for this game is a very Fantazio 8.5 out of 10. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been nice to sneak in another review for a title that came out this year, considering how much I've been pushing out other titles. And I hope you're excited for the next video, as I'm finally releasing another essay, one that might be my biggest and most ambitious yet, and I think many of you will enjoy it. Thanks again for watching, and if you want to support the channel and follow me on my content journey, do me a favor and like and sub down below, hit the bell for those sweet, sweet notifications, and comment to chat about the video, or if you just want to talk for the hell of it. I'm always up for a chat. That's all, folks. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time for more RPG content.